Hello world, it's Austin. Let's talk about being transgender and Christian. Lately I've had a bunch of messages from people who are really excited about being trans allies in their church, but they don't know how to start conversations about trans issues. Pretty understandable considering this is a big issue, it's like a hot button thing right now in politics, and lots of people don't know if their church is welcoming of trans folks or not. Well, in this video I want to give you 8 ways that you can start the conversation about affirming trans folks in your church. Number 1, ask questions. The first thing I do when I go into a church is I start looking around at their physical space and at their programming to see what kind of gendered things we just sort of assume and take in without really thinking about it. Does your church have a gender-inclusive bathroom? And if not, why? Does your church have men's and women's study groups and Bible studies? If so, why? Do people in your church only use he, him, and his pronouns for God? Why? Now, I'm not saying that any of these things are like bad things that you should be like, haha, church, see, you're doing it wrong. Maybe nobody has ever asked these questions before, so start by looking around you, noticing your surroundings, and then asking questions. Number 2, learn about trans folks that are doing work in your tradition or your denomination, and bring them up as examples in your faith community. With more and more trans folks coming out every day, there's gotta be somebody in your faith tradition, whether you know of them off the bat or not, but they're out there doing good work, so use them as an example. For instance, in the past year, the Lutheran magazine, which is the magazine for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which I am part of, they recently had an article out on the ELCA's first trans pastor, and you can clip an article like that out and stick it on your church's billboard or put it on the coffee table. It starts people talking and learning more about the people in their faith tradition. Number 3, work trans-related stories into things your church already does, like summer book groups or monthly movie nights. Talk to the people in charge and see if they'd be willing to read a book or check out a movie that has to do with trans stories, or even just includes trans people in a very small way. This is a great way to start conversation by just being exposed to new ideas. Number 4, if you feel confident about talking about scripture and talking about the Bible, you might even come at this whole conversation through a scriptural lens. Maybe your pastor one day preaches a sermon on a particular piece of scripture that you think really calls for a full welcome and affirmation for trans folks. You can bring that up at coffee hour later on. You can even bring it up with the pastor as you're going out the door. If you go by your pastor to shake hands or whatever, you can say, hey, I heard this in your sermon today. Did you hear that, or did you feel that when you were writing it? Even if your pastor says no, at least you've brought something up and you've sort of planted an idea for them. Number 5. Now, if that seems super scary and talking about the Bible is like, oh, I don't know enough to do that, then go at it through your own story and through your own experiences. If you're a cisgender person who has never really had to deal with gender dysphoria, you can always bring up good questions like, how did you know that you were male or female? Or do you ever remember at one point being shamed for doing something that wasn't, associated with your gender? Bringing up questions like that in small group discussions gets people thinking about the concept of gender, even if you're not delving into transgender issues. You can also make things personal by talking about a trans person that you know. Now, obviously, you never want to out anybody, you never want to use somebody's name if they don't want to be talked about, but you can always say to your pastor, like, hey, I have this trans friend who would really love to be part of a church community, but they're not sure if they would be safe here, or they're not sure if they would be welcomed here. That puts a very personal lens on things, so that it's not an ideological issue, it's not a political subject of discussion, it's about a person who'd like to come to church. Number 6, talk to the people in charge in your congregation and see if you can distribute some resources for people. Lots of churches have sort of like a coffee hour area. You could maybe put out a pamphlet from PFLAG or from the HRC, something that has to do with trans issues in faith communities, and just leave that there. That's a really good way to gauge people's feelings, too. Like, you can talk to your church administrator and say, hey, I've got these books about trans folks in the church, and I'd like to put them in the library. Do you think that would be okay? And that sort of starts a conversation about what the church in general thinks of those issues. Number 7, start adding pronouns to things. If your church has a church directory or a newsletter where people talk about news in their lives, or if you have a name tag Sunday where everybody wears a name tag so you can get to know each other, see if you can start adding pronouns to those things. Again, this is not like a transgender specific thing that you're like shoving in people's faces. You're just asking people to start thinking about what they like to be called and why they like to be called it. So if you add pronouns to a name tag on Name Tag Sunday, most people don't have to think about it. But it's a great opportunity for trans folks who maybe have non-traditional pronouns to come out in a very easy way if they ever want to. And number 8, the most obvious way to start a conversation about these issues is to go directly to your pastor or go to your church board and schedule a conversation. If you were going to start a conversation with somebody, either a group of you and the church board, or you personally and singularly with your pastor, there's 4 things that you might want to keep in mind. First of all, remember to pick an appropriate time and place. Don't lasso your pastor as they're going out the door from church, because they aren't going to remember anything. They're going to be too scattered anyways to plan a meeting. Instead, email them, give them a call, and say, hey, when are you open? When can we sit down and have a conversation? I'd like to bring up a couple of issues I've been thinking about. Picking a specific time and place helps give the impression that this is a serious thing that you really want to talk about. You don't want to just back somebody into a corner when they're not expecting it. You want to have a real listening and talking back and forth conversation. My second tip is that when you're actually sitting down to have this conversation, put forth your question or your request or the thing that you're wondering about or curious about. Put that forward and then listen. The first time you interact or have a conversation about trans issues, it's not about nailing things down and figuring things out. It's just about planting a seed. Don't expect huge results right away, because that's not how these things work. All you're doing is bringing something up and saying, hey, what do you think about this? The third tip is that if, when you're having this conversation, the person feels really hostile, or they don't want to talk about this issue, or they're really not okay with it, find some common ground. Talk about your commitment to the church, or why you feel so strongly about this. Put some personality into it. Help them realize that this is not just an issue that you're crusading for. This is something that means something to you. When you open up and you show somebody that you really care about an issue, they'll start to relate to you more as a human being and less as a poster child. And the last tip for conversation is to walk away and then follow up on the conversation later. So like I said, this is not to get things done. What you want to do is go in, have a conversation, listen, plant the seed, then walk away, and maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, send an email or talk with the pastor and say, hey, I really enjoyed our conversation. Have you thought about it anymore? Has anything else come up for you? And that way it gives them a little bit of time to think about things before you come back and maybe say hey, if that went really well, you can say hey, I'd love to have a conversation with the church board, or I'd love to have a conversation with these other people, or I'd love to bring in a trans educator, anything. But you've planted the seed, you got to give it a little bit of time to grow. Alright, finally, 2 words of warning. First, remember that leaders in your church are not always able to take a stand on these issues or to make huge changes. Sometimes they are bound by the people that are sort of above them in the church hierarchy, and they really can't do anything, or they risk losing their job. Even if you think this is something that they should really go to the mat for and risk losing their job, that's not your decision to make. That's their decision to make. So just realize that going in, that it's possible that as much as maybe your pastor wants to help, they can't. And the second warning is be prepared for some pushback. Be prepared for a little bit of strain and stress. This is just what happens when people are growing and when new ideas are coming together. It may be that your church just cannot move on these issues and you need to move towards radical inclusion of trans folks, and that might mean that you have to start attending another church. So just be aware of these things going in. So there are 8 ways of starting this conversation on trans inclusion in your church. I hope they helped. Let me know if they do. Let me know if you have these conversations. Get at me on Twitter. I'm at Austin Lionheart. I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/transandchristian, and you can hit me up in the comments down here as well. Let me know how these conversations go. If you have more ideas, put them in the comments too. I'd love to hear them. And hit the subscribe button so that I can see you back here next week. Alright, peace everybody. Bye.